So now that we added the logic to read data from a file, I also want to make sure that we can write data to a file, so that in process we can store the final result in a file instead of just outputting it here in the console. For that, back in File Manager, we can add a new function that could be called write_JSON, because I plan on storing data in the JSON format. So write_JSON sounds like a name that makes sense. And here I expect to get some data as input, which can actually be of any type, because many value types can be stored as JSON, and will of course add error handling to also catch the cases where this might be called on some value that can't be converted. So I generally want to accept every value, and in Go that can be expressed with that special interface thing here. Interface followed by empty opening and closing curly braces. Alternatively, there now also is the any type you could use, which is the same thing. It simply means that any value is allowed. Well, and in here I then do want to write data to a file. For that, we can again use the OS package, and for that we can use the create function to create a file if it does not exist yet, or truncate it, so basically empty it if it does exist, so that we always overwrite what's already in the file. Now here I then also expect to get the path, which should be a string, so that we can tell create where this file should be stored and what its name should be. And as a result, create will yield a pointer to such a file value, which we already know from open. There we also got such a file value. Or, as so often for create, we can also get back an error. So we got the file or the error like this. And we can therefore now check if the error is not equal to nil, so if we have a problem. And in that case, I will return a new error with my own error message, where I'll say failed to create file. Of course, at the moment, write_JSON doesn't expect a return value, so I will add one of type error. So that's the first step. We handle this error, and we hopefully therefore got a successfully created file. Now we need to write JSON data to that file. And that can be done with help of the JSON package, which is also part of the standard library. To be precise, it's a sub-package of the encoding package, you could say. And this JSON package here has a new encoder constructor function, which we will be able to use to convert values to text that follows that JSON format, so that has this JSON format. Now, the new encoder constructor function needs a writer type value as an input, and that also is an interface provided by Go, which thankfully is implemented by our file, just as the reader interface was implemented. So this file can be passed to new encoder, so that under the hood data will be written into this file. As a result, we'll get back an encoder value, and we can use this encoder value to then call the encode method. And that encode method then wants the data, which can be any kind of value. So we can forward that data that we're receiving as an input in our own function here, this data. We can forward this. And as a result, we'll get back an error if that failed. So if the data can't be converted to text in that JSON format. So we get back an error, at least potentially. Hence, we should add such a if check and check if the error is not nil, in which case we could return a custom error where we say failed to convert data to JSON. Thereafter, I want to call file close, and I also want to do that here if converting failed, so that we always close this file and then return nil, because here we were successful and I therefore don't want to return any error. And that's now a write_JSON function, which we can use in the prices Go file to write the result of our calculation here to a file. So instead of outputting some result here in the console, I'll rather use result as a value for the tax included prices key here in my struct, which therefore should actually now expect a map with string keys and string values, since we changed that earlier and we made sure that we got such a map of string keys and string values here. So now I want to use my job here and set tax included prices equal to the result, and then convert the entire job to a value that's stored in a file. So I want to call file manager write JSON, and the path should then be result.json maybe, and the value should be the job. So the entire job struct with all the data that's stored in there should be written to that file. However, this is not the final path I want to use here, because it's worth noting that, of course, we will have multiple jobs in our main.go file. There we are starting multiple jobs with that for loop, one job for each tax rate. So at the moment, with the current logic, I would keep on overwriting one and the same file, because I would always write to result.json from every job, but we'll have multiple jobs. So actually here we want different files for different jobs. Hence, I'll dynamically generate a string here with sprintf, let's say, where I in general want to have result.json, but I want to have an underscore and then here a placeholder for a value. And the value could be our tax rate, for example, because that will be different for every job. So we can use our tax rate that's stored in the job with job tax rate as a value that should be output here. Now actually, of course, in this program, the tax rates will be numbers like this, and I rather want to have numbers like 0, 7, 10, 15, and so on in my file name. Therefore, I'll multiply the tax rate with 100 and then output a floating point value here, but one where I output 0 decimal places, so that I just have the integer part in front of the decimal separator. And that should therefore be all. This should now write the entire struct, which includes the result data, to a JSON file, which has a different name for every job. Therefore, if you now make sure that you see the files that belong to this project, and you then run this code, you will no longer get an output here in the console, but you should see a bunch of files being created here. And if you take a look at those files here, you will see that in there you have the tax rate, the input prices, and then the tax included prices, which is this map where we have the input price and then the after tax price and so on, which makes more sense for tax rates above 0, where we then actually also see a difference. So that's working, and with that we're now also writing the results to the file system.